rationalvc.com. Iman, how many weeks or months has it been now without a haircut?
I've tied my hair back because I look like an idiot if I pull it out. I look like I look like those pictures on the wall of the Persian emperors from thousands of years ago with their hair curly and everywhere, which is it's a nice segue to our guest today.
It is indeed.
Bring back that look. You look like a member of Team Mali, the Iranian soccer team.
I'll take that as a compliment.
So yeah, look, I mean, without the deadlifts, without the haircuts, it does take a bit of a toll on the mental health. But we keep pushing and talking about mental health and Persian backgrounds and a lot of other things. It's a good way to lead into today's guest. So someone who I've been trying to get on, well, I've been following for a while on Twitter with who you could consider quote unquote a contrarian with his views. I share a lot of the sort of similar views, and it's the kind of thing that would, if I were to really share it on, let's say, LinkedIn or somewhere, get you in trouble because but I see it as pretty much speaking the truth. So very interesting background. Where do we begin? I'll give a very quick overview of his background before we go in. So he is a Harvard psychologist with now with a PhD. He started in the corporate world. Now a clinical professor at a university, UCSF Medical School, Department of Psychiatry. Worked as a consumer health consultant to big companies such as Google. He was a founding medical director at Omada Health, which is huge. It goes on and on. He's an executive psychologist to some of the biggest names in Silicon Valley. He is a VC investor part-time on the side. And an advisor, so professor, executive psychologist, and he's launched his own company a few months ago. So I think it's fair to say he's got his finger in many pies. Welcome to the show, Dr. Cam Sepah, and I have to do this for the culture. I have to say it the Iranian way once, Dr. Cam Sepah. Welcome to the show.
I appreciate the proper pronunciation. It's a pleasure to join you today.
Awesome. So give us a quick overview. I mean, I've been over your background. We don't want to spend too long on it. There's a lot to cover, but who is Dr. Sepah, and what's led you down this path of all the views that I said, these views you share online, and just who you are as a person? What's led to this fascination you have with the area of psychology and just the mindset behind investing in entrepreneurship and then leading Maximus?
Yeah, it's a longer story, but I'll give you the TLDR version of it. So I grew up in San Diego, was always a good student, athlete, enjoyed my life growing up. In a lot of ways, I think I was actually very blessed because I had actually very little pressure prior to the age of 16. My parents prioritized education, but they were not pushy at all. And I think I fortunately got good grades. So they were the opposite of most immigrant parents. They're just like, all right, keep doing what you're doing. I think you're doing okay. And, I went to public school as well. So there wasn't as much of the competitiveness, I think, that you see of like prepping kids for college. I didn't even think about college. So I was like halfway through high school, to be honest with you. And then I was like, oh, I should, do these SATs and think about where I'm going to go to school. But, fortunately, I've been doing well. I got lucky enough to get into Harvard. And while I was there, I kind of really fell in love with mind-body medicine. It's kind of the intersection of psychology and medicine. I worked in the Harvard Cognitive Neuroscience Lab under one of the leaders of the field, Steve Kosslyn, and got to do really cool research. So he met up with the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama was really into science. And he's like, you can test some of these claims that we make about the benefits of, meditation in the Buddhist tradition. So he literally lent us his monks. And so we got to study folks like Mathieu Ricard, who's a pretty famous monk in his own right, and would do, studies on his ability to regulate his emotions. And it was pretty amazing, in terms of the benefits, and really got me to see and also get hard data showing that, psychology has a tremendous impact, not only on our happiness and well-being, obviously, but even our physical health, and physiological things that we don't think we can control. Like Mathieu could actually shut off his startle response. You could shoot a gun off next to his head and he wouldn't blink, right? No other person I know in recorded history in the world that can pull that off, right? And so it was kind of tip of the stem research of showing what are the potentials of the human potential, and what could translate down to us who is not going to necessarily meditate for 30 years. But can we start to see some of those benefits in very practical ways, whether it's learning to, have greater emotional equanimity in dealing with day-to-day stress? Can it help us better manage chronic diseases, and just live happier, healthier lives? So I said, I want to make my career about that. I ended up going to UCLA, which is the top clinical psych program in the country, particularly because they had a whole center for what's called psychoneuroimmunology, which is just a fancy word for how do emotions influence immune function. So I was like, I'm going to do the most hard science research possible to show that, some of these psychological interventions and positive emotional states influence really hard markers. So I was researching things called pro-inflammatory cytokines, which are basically markers of the immune function that are proxies for inflammation, and showing that, for instance, in breast and prostate cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy and radiation, people who had greater life satisfaction had predicted their levels of inflammation in their months. And we do repeated blood tests as part of their cancer treatment. And so it's very convincing data. It's just like ask a few questions and literally predicts these blood markers for a very long time, which are important in the context of obviously overcoming cancer. So, it was interesting. Like I work with psychologists, immunologists, and kind of see the intersection of both fields. And so, it was really intellectually exciting. But for me, my mom's a public health nurse. I always thought about impact, right? Which is how can I take the work that I'm doing and help as many people as possible? I started doing a lot more clinical work. I did a whole internship, residency, and fellowship training in behavioral medicine, which is this intersection between psychology and medicine. How do you use behavioral treatments to treat chronic diseases? And long story short, that's how I ended up at Amada, which was, I was doing this work in hospital settings, running behavioral diabetes management programs, but was like, asking someone to come to a hospital every week to get treatment is not practical. And I said, telemedicine is the future. This Zoom that we're doing right now is the way that medicine is going to be practiced in the next decade. So let me make my career about that, because if we can make treatment accessible and scalable to millions of people that they can do in the comfort and convenience of their own homes, then we can help a lot of people. And that's essentially what Amada did. We helped about 500,000 people lose 5 million pounds and cut their risk of diabetes in half. And just really opened my eyes to, how much you can help a much broader population of people using technology. So in a lot of ways, I always joke I'm a reluctant entrepreneur. I never wanted to be an entrepreneur. I was happy being a doctor, working in hospitals and helping people. I just realized that technology is the best way to make scalable treatments. And corporations and startups are the best way of delivering that to as many people as possible. So that's what we're doing now with Maximus. Maximus is a consumer health company that focuses on men and optimizing their health and performance. And our goal is to help 1 million people this time around, using technology, psychology, and medicine.
Really interesting, because the focus of this podcast is really about building and investing in tech, but that's a really broad remit, right? And so as part of building and investing, there are certain ways of needing to think, certain ways of needing to be aware of your psyche, really, and how you think and why, therefore, you are prone to certain ways of thinking. Myself, for example, I recently I work really long hours, and recently I was undergoing some reactions from not realizing I was under stress, if that makes sense. And, I'd come out in rashes, I'd get like really hot at times. I don't know what it was. And I read the Mind Body Prescription by Dr. Sarno. And the book was really about picking up on being aware of sort of memories, or if it's things that have happened in your past that are causing you to act in certain ways in the future. And I'm quite a scientific, factful guy. The name of this podcast is Rational VC, right? Because we're trying to be as rational as possible. But looking into that, thinking through that lens was actually very useful in helping me understand how I need to deal with my stress and not just put it under the carpet. And I think that's a nice segue into what Maximus Tribe is trying to do in helping people, right? So is it possible to deep dive a bit more into why you started it and kind of what the aim, I know apart from helping a million people, but what are some of the more granular aims of the business?
Yeah. So we're actually pre-launch. So we're still a little bit in stealth. So there's a side of the business that we'll talk about after we launch, but I can at least tell you the sort of the philosophy and the impetus, behind it. And it's a couple of things. In short, the goal of Maximus is actually to maximize masculinity, which unfortunately I think in this day and age may be a controversial thing. But my position is masculinity and femininity in their mature forms are positive healing forces in society. Unfortunately, I think they've been unnecessarily vilified. And that's one of the things that I started to notice as a psychologist in sort of the public awareness, which I thought was very strange and harmful, in fact, socially. You saw this in commercials like Gillette talking about toxic masculinity, which had a huge backlash because I was like, who do you think your customers are? They're men. Why are we slandering, men? And, the point that I was making is clearly, the whole Me Too movement had a justified cause in the sense that obviously sexual harassment, sexual abuse, these vices clearly should be punished. No question about it. As a psychologist, I treated especially members of the military with sexual trauma. Obviously, it's a horrific, issue that we should absolutely punish and not condone. But I think, you take this sort of very justified and legitimate issue, and then you layer on politics on top of it and saying that this is an issue around masculinity. There's something inherent about men that's evil is the implication with the term toxic masculinity. Ironically, the term itself is toxic because nobody uses the term toxic femininity, right? It's a double standard in fact. It's very strange to even, that's one thing, companies will say stupid stuff, but the American Psychological Association, which is the organization that, trains, is responsible for the training program of psychologists, also came out and said that certain traits like competitiveness and aggression are things we should not be teaching boys because they're harmful or toxic, which was also nonsense because it's really the application and sublimation of these traits that are important. Aggression, as I mentioned, in sports, obviously, if you do it in a way that follows the rules and has good sportsmanship, is absolutely necessary to compete and win in sports and in life. And it should not be something that we should be subduing. Same thing with competitiveness. Men especially are in a hyper-competitive society. You do not teach boys to successfully compete. Obviously, you don't want to do it with like a pointy elbows, nasty kind of way, but people should understand that they will be compared and ranked. And how do you think you get through school and get performance evaluations at work? This is an inherently competitive society. You need people to teach people how to do that in a way that's pro-social and that's not stressful. But to deny that competitiveness is a part of society and not prepare people for it, I think is in fact emasculating and unprepared and not adequately preparing boys to be men. And so I saw this going on, and I'm like the least political person possible, but I was like, I think we're actually doing public harm by sending out this message that's literally anti-masculinity. I think it's promoted by certain, quite frankly, misandrist elements of society. That's the opposite of misogyny. I thought someone has to speak up and be against it. So that's part of it. So that's the kind of like the social political aspect of it. On the other hand, there's this very physiological war on masculinity that's going on right now too, in that if you look at the data, testosterone is going down 1% per year generationally. So a man in 1980 had 40% greater testosterone than the same age man in 2020, which is a pretty remarkable difference. And it's even if you control for obesity and smoking and other lifestyle factors, it's still going down. We don't know exactly why. It may be environmental pollutants. There's a lot of pesticides and endocrine disrupting chemicals that we're consuming now through food and beverages. But we've seen this trend happen linearly, and it's not just testosterone. Sperm counts, sperm quality is going down. And so literally men are physiologically less masculine as a result of, this generational trend and the factors that are going on. And so literally there's kind of an assault or a war on masculinity on that level. And it's even, we're starting to see it psychologically as well. There's a very interesting poll in the US where they asked men of different ages, how masculine do you feel on a 0 to 6 scale, right? If you assume sort of 5 or 6 is highly masculine, in our father's generation, men over the age of 65, 82% say, I feel highly masculine. If you ask guys under the age of 30, right? So you're talking now the youngest generation, the minority of men now feel masculine. This huge generational change. Now, partly it may be explained by the fact they have lower testosterone levels, but I think partly it is a social issue too, because maybe they don't want to associate with being masculine because they think it's toxic now, right? The indoctrination has sort of taken place and they think, oh, you know, people are going to judge me, or I'm not going to get as many dates if I associate it with it, because their brainwashing of sort of what masculinity is like a hyper masculine machismo stereotype, which in my opinion, and if you ask any psychologist, that's not masculinity. That's a performative, almost like imitation of what masculinity is by men or boys who are immature, right? Mature masculinity is not arrogant. It's actually very, like, if you talk to someone who's confident, they're not arrogant at all because they're secure in themselves, right? It's a lot more of this calm, cool, collected, strong, silent type, right? And it certainly doesn't mean that men can express emotions either. Obviously, you know, there's a lot of people who do that. And so in order to counteract this, I just, you know, socially was promoting this hashtag called tonic masculinity. It's the antidote to toxic masculinity, saying that masculinity and femininity in their mature forms are like a healing antidote to society. And we showcase videos of that being true and saying, okay, some of these masculine virtues that people don't think are important, like courage in the modern day and age. You see men who are rescuing children or animals and like drowning in lakes. You see Kobe Bryant being a great girl dad to Gianna, and other positive, robust, emotionally sensitive, and strong versions of masculinity to dispel this sort of narrative that masculinity is toxic. So that was sort of the impetus that I thought started me interested in issues of masculinity, because I saw this both psychological and physiological assault on masculinity. And as I mentioned, my whole background was in mind-body medicine. So, you know, you're seeing this sort of happening. You're like, well, how can we counteract this? And so that kind of became the impetus for Maximus, which is, well, how do we take the best of psychology and medicine to correct this trend that we're seeing in society? So we're doing some stuff, really, really exciting, cutting edge work on the medicine side to counteract this physiological trend that we're seeing. And then on the psychological side, what I saw was there was a lack of cohesiveness and also mentorship, right? If you kind of follow the original sort of mythopoetic men's movement, which is one of the early movements that was sort of promoting a healthy masculinity, they talked about how a lot of boys don't become men because they lack what are called ritual elders, right? It's not the primary responsibility of just the father to raise men, because maybe even the father himself is incomplete or has his own issues, and it's too dangerous to be relying on one person. That's why you have uncles and older brothers and cousins and coaches and teachers. It really takes a village to raise a man. And unfortunately, in a hyper individualistic, especially American society, a lot of that is missing these days. And so what we thought we'd do is we literally create an online tribe where men can get together. We have about 1,000 members of our community now on Discord, Facebook, and Reddit. You can join. We'll put links after this podcast. And it's free to the community, and just saying, hey, look, if you feel alone, you don't have to feel alone. There's 1,000 guys that are out there who can support you. There's even like local meetups in various cities that people can get together. If you're a young man looking for mentorship, we have guys who are married, successful in their careers, and they just want to give back and be mentors. And same thing, they may want social support as well. We've launched squads so that if people are trying to get accountability to make changes, positive, healthy changes in their life, improve their diet, exercise, sleep, stress, focus, relationships, they have weekly accountability groups. We put people into about groups of 10 people. They set what their goals are, and they're like, all right, I want to go to the gym 3 times a week. Hold me accountable, guys. And they'll do that. And they'll provide support and encouragement and a little bit of like positive competitiveness to see who can outcompete one another. Because, you know, my thesis is self-improvement was never meant to be done alone. It was always meant to be done with a group or a team or a tribe of people, because that's, you know, how we were raised for 50,000 years. It's only in this very hyper-individualistic society that we put the burden of responsibility on individual boys and men and say, good luck, figure it out on your own. And if you happen not be super strong or totally developed at age 18, well, you're shit out of luck. So in order to counteract that, I think we're really trying to provide a positive social support community, which we know from the psychological literature is critical to not only behavior change, but thriving to men of all ages in order to address the psychological side of things as well.
This is one of the topics that I'm really passionate about, and I'd like to see after this how me and Iman can help over in London with the community aspect. But my introduction to the topic of masculinity was many years ago through David Data's work, Way of the Superior Man, etc. And in my opinion, masculinity has been dead for a while, and I think it's much needed what you're saying. And some of it due to the, as we may both agree, the Soillennials in Silicon Valley, who are very much focused on, just let's optimize this ad and this algorithm to get some kids to click it to drive more ad revenue and so on and so forth, while they just stay in a dark room with the body frame of a kid, low testosterone. And a lot of this, which we'll get onto shortly, which leads into your performance actually, as a founder, as in your personal life and many other aspects. Before we move on to a ton of wisdom you have on the psychology of investors and more importantly founders, if you can just quickly, I know you'd like to keep it humble, but name drop some of the big name investors if you can, who have invested in the Maximus projects that you're working on, because some big names there, and sort of any advice you have to founders seeking investment from such names.
Yeah, we're very fortunate that we got literally the top investors in Silicon Valley to invest in us, and I think that's for a couple of reasons. I mean, this is not my first rodeo; it's the third company that I've started, and unfortunately have a little bit of success under my belt. And no if ands or buts about it. That obviously helps when you're a serial successful entrepreneur. But to be honest with you, I didn't think we'd have the success even with that we did. And I honestly think and know it's actually because of the deep mission-driven nature of the company. What we're doing does have a huge market. It has a potential to obviously be very profitable. So obviously from a financial perspective, the investors, they're savvy. They obviously they need to produce a return on investment. But the other part of what we're doing is deeply mission driven, right? So Keith Rabois from Founders Fund and Joe Lonsdale from ABC are our lead investors. And, the moment that I pitched them, they're like, we're in. Like, we understand what you're talking about this sort of war against masculinity. Joe's like, I write about this online in my sort of private friend group on a regular basis. So, they empathize and commiserate very much. And, even though we're a little bit different in terms of our political views, it's actually a great example, by the way, of like the positive nature of sort of open-mindedness, right? That people, even with differing beliefs or value systems, can work together towards a higher goal. And I respect them a ton. They're both billionaires who've done tremendously well as operators and as investors. So we're very fortunate to have them. And we have a great cast of angel investors as well. So Dave Asprey from Bulletproof is an angel investor. In a lot of ways, we're modeling our company after him in terms of we're producing a lot of content. We have our own podcast. We have a call-in radio show. We're going to be producing a lot of great materials for folks in order to improve their health and performance. Ryan Holiday, who's famous for all the books he's written on Stoicism, is a big supporter in terms of what we're doing. Brian Lee started the Honest Company with Jessica Alba. Is one of the preeminent angel investors here in LA as well. Fred Ersham, founder of Coinbase. Brian Norgard, who used to run product at Tinder. And Jeff Weiser, who was a former chief marketing officer of Shopify. So a really great cast and crew of very successful consumer investors, advisors, operators. And I think that, they really just supported the mission and vision of what we're doing. Because I think, there's a lot of ways to make a buck in Silicon Valley. There's a lot of great companies that are able to do that. There's not as many companies that are genuinely, I would say, mission driven and are providing a positive force of good for the world. And I think people increasingly want to put their money in, a thing that's not only profitable, but has a genuine social cause and mission that's going to help a lot of people too.
On that note, and given we're going to kind of go into the psychology of founders and investors, based on some of the names you mentioned, I mean, they're really big names. You talk about this, I think, either in a podcast or somewhere you've written about the interplay between abnormality and success. Mm-hmm. Are these investors, are you abnormal? And to what extent does that enable you to be a strong CEO or a strong investor by essentially being someone that's counter to what people would see as being constructive or normal in society?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the word that you're using, right? Abnormal can be a synonym for exceptional, right? So by definition, exceptional people are abnormal, right? They're the far bleeding edge of the bell curve, at least in some respect. I also, as a clinician, also think about pathology a lot, right? And how functional pathology can be. There are certainly higher representations of certain types of pathology I've observed and seen in Silicon Valley, because I also coach a bunch of tech CEOs on the side. Definitely higher rates of autism spectrum, or what was previously called Asperger's syndrome, especially in the more technical folks. It can certainly be a superpower, quite frankly, in terms of, being able to focus, have technical brilliance, et cetera. It does often, though, however, sometimes come with deficits in cognitive empathy in terms of being able to understand where people are coming from, which leads to challenges, I think, as they scale and they have to manage a lot of people. So this is the sort of story, the backstory that no one talks about is you get the brilliant technical founders, they come along and, generate a new brilliant product, but they don't run the company very well. And so they would usually get ousted, but get replaced by a very socially savvy professional MBA, CEO. And that was in fact the model prior to, I would say, Facebook and kind of the founder fund era that said, no, we're going to keep the original founders in place. And even if they are, quite frankly, socially lacking, we're going to surround them with a COO or other support systems in order to help manage people, help coach them, but that the original DNA and kind of the product brilliance of the company needs to be held in place. And I actually like that model better. So it doesn't mean that obviously if you do have if you're on somewhere on the spectrum, or even if you have any sort of psychological, whether even if you want to call it an issue, or maybe it's a non-neurotypicalness, if you want to use a more PC term, it's not necessarily an exclusion. Same thing with ADHD. I'd say the rate of ADHD is about 5 times higher in founders than the general population, I would estimate. Those folks can be very brilliant visionary types, but they're also not executors. And you need to pair them with a very executionally oriented person who's highly conscientious and can almost counterbalance and make up for the lack of organization and working memory issues that come along with ADHD. So you see that a lot. You also see a lot of folks on the bipolar spectrum. In fact, there's a whole book about this called The Hypomanic Edge that a colleague of mine wrote, talking about how they may not be full-blown bipolar type 2, but there may be like hyperthymic, don't need a lot of sleep, high energy kind of person. The little bit of the positive delusionality that comes with mania as well. And you see this with folks who potentially, I'm not diagnosing, but like folks like Adam Newman of WeWork, when you read about kind of his sleep and the delusions of grandeur, sounds very, very manic-y, I would say. And maybe that's what, a multi-billion-dollar company sort of needs. It is a very fine line, though, because obviously, he did not continue as the leader of that company and ran into a lot of problems. So it's a very delicate double-edged sword that people have to walk a line, both as a founder and as an investor. So, I think investors should actually do a much better job of, quite frankly, psychologically assessing founders and understanding what is the pathology that they're willing to deal with. Like, I'll tell you, my personal no is like, ADHD, autism, bipolar, as long as it's well controlled and managed and, they're either on medication or therapy, or they've learned to kind of deal with it on their own and channel it positively, sublimating, I don't think it's necessarily an issue. It's more the dark triad personality disorders that I get worried about. Narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, right? You definitely run into those founders in Silicon Valley too. And that's when you start getting into immoral, illegal, unethical behavior that can screw employees over, screw investors over, screw the public over. That's much harder to deal with, because then you're talking a little bit more on the what some people might call evil side of behavior. And that's a lot harder to remedy and manage, quite frankly. I've talked about this too, in that they make terrible employees. Like I, in fact, in our company, I assess for some of these traits, and we don't hire assholes. We have a no asshole rule, as Professor Bob Sutton at Stanford University Business School says, because it's too much of a hassle to deal with. I would say certain founders, if they're not reporting to anyone but a board or their customers, or maybe like salespeople who are in individual contributor roles and they're not managing anyone, a highly technical person who, again, is not managing anyone, you could have some of those people at the company, if they're kind of left alone to do their own thing and they're not influencing too many other people. I've seen it work, but for everyone else, if they have to work a lot collaboratively with other people, manage other people, they're a giant pain in the ass. It's not worth it. And most companies make the mistake of hiring people who are very talented, high performers, who are assholes, and they ruin the company. And not only that, but literally cause legal problems. So I highly recommend that you sort of don't go down that route. So I guess my message is it's not to avoid pathology. We're all pathological to some degree on some spectrum. Nobody's perfect. And quite frankly, Silicon Valley is a bunch of quirky weirdos who are misfits and weren't popular in high school, and they want to make up for that, and that's the chip on their shoulder. But you should be cognizant of the pathology that you are willing to invest in or hire. One final note on this is this sort of notion of the chip on the shoulders. Josh Wolf, I believe at Lux Capital, has this whole thesis about investing in people who have chip on their shoulders. I get it. I have a little bit of a more nuanced view, in the sense that a lot of people that I run into want to start companies in order to prove something. And I think that's a very dangerous line to walk as a founder, in that if there's a difference, and I have a whole Twitter thread about this, about using a wound to generate something positive for the community, right? You may have had a loss. Like, I actually know someone who lost their dad to brain cancer and then started a company that does, diagnostic testing to find better cancer drugs, right? Obviously, clearly comes from his own sort of wound, but he's like, look, I don't want this to ever happen again to someone else. And I'm going to, make an effort to, help the world. And that can be very positive. But to me, as a psychologist, the differentiation that I make is that the wound should generally be healed before you go and start that company. Right? Because the difference is, if it's not, then everything becomes, it's like a festering wound, and the company, because of all the stress that you're going to, never lets it heal. Right? And I see a lot of almost like angry founders who are like, oh, my dad never loved me. My girlfriend broke up with me. I'm going to show them, right? It's almost like the thesis of the whatever that social net Facebook movie was, right? And those people burn out, in my experience, and or end up doing things that are not sort of great for the company. That's a very different thing versus like, I've been into therapy, I've gotten over it, but still now from a positive place, it's like, great, I want to make it my life's mission to bring whatever into the world. And I think the difference is, you can almost tell when you look back upon that experience, if it's a poignant bittersweetness of like, yes, I miss this person, but I'm over it, I've resolved it, it's a positive blessing that I'm bringing into the world, then, and probably you should actually get, consult with the therapist too, that you're really over it, you're not just deluding or rationalizing yourself, then great, go pursue that. I actually think less than 5% of people should take that route, to be honest. Most people should honestly go to therapy and move on with their lives, and not go channel it into a company, because it's quite frankly not worth it. But a lot of people, I would say, if you go back and you think about some trauma or wrong that was done to you, or the love that you never got, and you're still kind of bitter about it, and you're like, now I'm going to prove this to the world. Are you going to be successful? Yeah, there's a lot of bitter people who work 16 hours a day to prove something. So Josh is right. Chips on shoulders do create chips in pockets, meaning they do make a lot of money, but they do not ultimately fulfill you and leave you satisfied. You're going to end up probably being rich and just as miserable as you originally were, because you never dealt with the original issue. So be careful what you wish for is the message that I like to share with people on that front.
Yeah, so on the back of that, I know before you've shared your views elsewhere and you've done some work on this where you've said that founders fall in two buckets. One is you're either a psychopath, and the other is where, you know, you're like everyone else, but you're driven, but you have to work on it through, let's say, an executive psychologist like yourself. Can you talk about that whole aspect and touch on it? And are the most successful founders psychopaths, the ones that don't go through any coaching long term? And also, if you can just touch on why founders have to be quote unquote chief psychologists, as they say.
Yeah, I don't know exactly where you got that from. I'm pretty sure I had a more nuanced view than that. You certainly don't have to be a psychopath to be a founder. I mean, the rate of psychopathy in the general population is probably about 1%. It's actually pretty rare if you're talking about true psychopaths. Among CEOs, it's overrepresented. It's maybe around 5%, but still, I mean, that's probably more than it should be, and it makes probably everyone a little uncomfortable. But yeah, 95% of people aren't, and you certainly don't need to be. I think probably I'm guessing what I said at that time was just psychopaths obviously don't feel emotions in the same way. And so they don't get affected by the day-to-day stress and anxiety. Like I'll tell you, like when I negotiate with people, it makes me anxious because it's like a little adversarial, and I've gotten a lot of training and I'm better at it. But it's like if you go back and forth and push a bunch of times, it just like raises my blood pressure, man. Like it is what it is, Fortunately, I don't avoid anything and I deal with it. But, if you're a psychopath, you're just like, I don't care. Like I will like push to the nth degree and it doesn't affect me at all. So, I think they probably have a little bit less wear and tear emotionally as a result of that. It is what it is. I don't think you need to be steely though, or if you're not obviously wired like that, you shouldn't try to attempt to be like that. In fact, we know that suppressing emotions backfires, right? And certainly a lot of people, essentially that drives them to addiction is they get really stressed and then after work they numb, distract, or avoid themselves, whether it was substances or digital, distraction. So I highly do encourage people to find an executive psychologist. I recommend people do work with licensed mental health professionals. There's a lot of people who call themselves executive coaches. I don't know what the hell that means. Quite honestly, anyone can call themselves an executive coach. I think there's a confusion between people who've been serial CEOs and they mentor and teach people to be a CEO. That's a different thing. That's like, I'm going to teach you how to run your business. And I don't do that. I tell people, look, it's your job to run your business. I'm a rare person who's been a psychologist and a CEO, so I know what it's like to be in your shoes, but we're using evidence-based frameworks like ACT, which come from psychotherapy and is used in psychotherapy to deal with your problems. The only difference is you don't have to have a problem to come to me. 80% of my clients do not have any diagnosable mental health issues. And I know that because I actually do a full psychiatric intake just to make sure that they don't have any, whether it's a mood disorder or some of these personality disorders that I was telling you about, make sure they're not psychopaths, or if they are, well, we'll manage it. I've never actually worked with one directly as a client. But it's helpful because it is an incredibly stressful, lonely job as a founder. And so you should actually do it preventatively. The analogy that I make is think about professional athletes. Every single professional athlete, even the top level Olympic ones, LeBron James, have not only one coach, probably multiple coaches working on them. And they're smart enough and they've been around, like how long has LeBron been playing? Like 17 years. He could coach other people, but you just can't see the back of your head. You don't know your own form. You want someone else doing your training and programming and just taking care of that for you. And also providing like a healing, positive relationship. A lot of the founders work with me long-term because it's not like they're like, hey, help me fix my social anxiety when I pitch, and let's do this in 8 weeks. We could do that. Like I could help someone tremendously in terms of their performance anxiety in a very short period of time. But most people work long-term because, from an older school tradition of psychotherapy, you want like a concierge. You want someone who has your back and you can have an honest, 100% authentic relationship with, which founders, by the way, can't. You can't be 100% honest with your employees because they're looking to you. And if you're anxious, they become anxious. You can't be 100% honest with your board because they're judging you. And quite frankly, they can fire you. And then your spouse, you can be with, but it's like, how much of work do you want to dump on them? So it's really nice to have sort of a neutral person who's empathic and can actively listen and also understands kind of the things that you're going through. and use that to correct a lot of the stuff, right? A lot of founders do have some interpersonal challenges, whether it's with their co-founders, and co-founder conflict is really common, issues with their employees, issues with investors, that they're sometimes repeating interpersonal patterns that have come from whether it's their background, childhood, parenting, et cetera. And so therapy, and like if they're replaying that in the therapeutic dynamic, you can provide a positive corrective emotional experience for them. While, you know, they may be like antagonistic and it pushes everyone away and they quit, right, their company. If they're doing that to me, I'm like, I see what's happening. I'm not going to quit on you. It does make me feel a certain way, and I'm going to provide you that feedback, and let's work through it, right? Most people don't have the insight or wherewithal to not run away when people are pushing or antagonistic or, you know, causing issues. But versus obviously in a psychotherapeutic dynamic, you're aware of it, you call it out, and you work on it. That's the work to do together. So that can be tremendously helpful as well. So that's part of the work that I do. The other part of the work that I do is very holistic in the sense that I'm much more holistic than most psychologists because of the mind-body medicine background that I mentioned. My whole thesis is CEOs are high-performance athletes, right? You're working 8, 10, 12 hours a day. You should treat yourself like an athlete. We optimize your diet, your exercise, your sleep, your focus, your relationships, so that you are in the optimal mental and physical health for you to go out and make the best business decisions possible. Sure, if you want my advice occasionally on stuff, as a former founder, I'll give you my point of view. But generally, psychologists are not in the advice giving business. I give people frameworks to do so, and I really hold them accountable, and I do a lot of programming for them in order to optimize their health so that, you know, they're operating at 100, 110% and doing the right things and making the best decisions.
Let's deep dive into a couple of those things that you would do with clients. You talk about dopamine fasting,
right?
What is that, and why should people do it?
Yeah, so I have a love-hate relationship with technology. I don't think so. Technology is neither good nor evil. It's really the application of it. Obviously, you can use technology for good. Like I said, you know, my first company helped 500,000 people lose 5 million pounds. Clearly, a great application of technology to improve people's health. The problem with engagement-based, particularly social media and consumer apps, is it's in the business of stealing people's attention. And quite frankly, they're like digital drug dealers. And Silicon Valley should quite frankly be ashamed of themselves for doing so. There's like presentations that I think the founder of Netflix has said, where he's like, our biggest competitor is sleep, right? And I was like, that's sad. Like you're literally trying to get people to sleep less so you can have them watch more Netflix, right? Or same thing, you're trying to get people to be on social media as much as possible when you sell ads so that you can get more eyeballs and more clicks and get people to buy useless shit that they don't need, right? Now, obviously there's a positive to it in that, you know, that there are positive products and services, obviously, that people, could buy. But honestly, it'd be better if there were a subscription model where you paid for the social network and, it didn't rely on trying to get you to use it as much as possible, right? The negative that I see, and I've seen this in a lot of founders, is they're not as much of, some people obviously do abuse substances, caffeine, alcohol, or even harder drugs. But increasingly I see digital addiction as the way that people escape, right? Especially long days at work, social media, gambling, pornography, or just distracting themselves by going down a Reddit rabbit hole, because it creates hyper focus and it makes all those negative feelings go away. Increasingly, I just saw this more and more, and the psychiatric community is recognizing it as more and more of a problem. Internet gaming disorder is now a diagnosable issue, because we're seeing this, especially, trickle over. Asia was about 10 years ahead of the US. You see, especially young men with playing video games 10, 12 hours a day, not eating, not taking care of themselves, literally physically falling apart. And so they put them in boot camps, which is kind of crazy to hear, right? It sounds like a person who's a drug addict, because quite frankly, on a neurological level, it is as stimulating as drugs. It's just being produced endogenously rather than taking it through, medication or an injection. We shouldn't consider it any different, because to me, the definition of addiction is distress and impairment, right? Is it bothering you, and is it getting in the way of your social or your occupational functioning? And clearly someone who's really busy, but they're wasting all of their free time online and distracting themselves, and at the detriment of their health and their relationships and work. That's a problem. That is an addiction. So whether you want to call it a problematic behavior or an addiction, I don't really care about the semantics of it. But that's the problem that I saw. And other countries, like I said, have recognized this problem. In fact, China has instituted their own version of dopamine fasting. If you're a minor under the age of 18, you cannot play video games between the hours of 10 p.m. and 8 a.m., I believe. It's like literally like the software turns off, and you can't spend more than an X amount of money on it without your parents being notified. I think you can use it an hour per day on weekdays and 3 hours on weekends and holidays, because they're like, look, people just overdo this damn thing, and we have to enforce these software developers, these game developers, to put limits in the games. And you could say
they're not, sorry to jump in, but they're not incentivized to do so, right? So if you leave it to a free market to make that decision, it's never going to fucking happen. So you're going to have to get the regulators involved. And I think that's where the US has always lagged, especially being from Europe ourselves, where there's obviously a lot more regulation. I would argue, I mean, you need that step in from government.
Right. Yeah. And, the US is much more freedom loving. So I don't see that happening here. So, my thesis is, look, you have to self-regulate, right? Because the thing is, relying on willpower is a losing battle. You have multi-billion-dollar companies with the best behavioral psychologists, UX designers, engineers, learning how to get you hooked, right? And they've established the habit. Most people pick up this phone like 150 times a day. That's reinforcement conditioning that's happening there. And you pick it up without even you being conscious of it now. Whenever you feel hungry, angry, lonely, or any other negative emotion, right? It's a successful sort of positive negative programming that sort of happened. So essentially dopamine fasting is the antidote to that, which is how can I regain my self-regulation or my impulse control? And the idea is very similar to intermittent fasting, right? Which is like, a lot of people overeat because they're eating 24 hours a day. Obviously, we're not designed to eat all the time. So you restrict it. Like, that's why we socially have set up 3 meals a day as like, these are the periods that you use it, and you don't generally eat otherwise. Why don't we treat digital devices the same way? So my thesis is, look, use with principle called stimulus control. It's not to say that you can't use it, right? This is not an abstinence only model where you can like decide, okay, I'm not going to smoke and I'll never smoke another cigarette in my life. It's really hard to stay away from the computer or social media, whether for social or even professional reasons. So if we're doing more of a moderation-based model, the idea is, okay, decide how much is reasonable. Let's say 30 minutes, 60 minutes a day. I'm going to only use it between the hours of 7 and 8 p.m. I'm going to put a timer on my phone so that I can make sure I only use it during those times. And then the other times, I'm not going to do it, right? So you can start out easier. You can say, for instance, 1 to 4 hours at the end of every day, I'm going to unplug from digital devices, let kind of my brain kind of reset a little bit. And I recommend extended periods of fasting. So 1 day a week, so Saturday or Sunday at the end of every week, 1 weekend a quarter, 1 week a year is helpful to unplug and kind of, let our sort of minds and bodies restore itself. So that's basically the basis of dopamine fasting. You can do it with digital devices. You can do it with any other, quite frankly, behavioral addiction. Could be binge eating, gambling, shopping, thrill seeking, anything that's a problematic or addictive behavior. You can sort of use the principles of stimulus control, kind of surfing the urge, kind of noticing it arising, not kind of giving into it, and controlling it using these sort of time windows in order to abstain and get greater control over your life. So I published this article in like August of last year. It went viral, finally all over the world. Fortunately, there's a bunch of confusion. If you read the press about it, it just shows how bad media is. Some people promote it as saying, oh, it's like asceticism, and you're not supposed to like have any stimulation or talk to people. And I was like, that's insane. No psychologist or doctor would tell people not to socialize or exercise. It's really about picking particular problematic behaviors and trying to, restrict or control them. If you don't have a bad relationship with, technology and you have perfect willpower, you don't need to do dopamine fasting. But I would say a lot of people I know certainly do. And there's research that backs it up. They had a group of college students look at their Facebook use. They were using it for almost 2 hours a day, right? So almost 14 hours a week. They randomized them into 2 groups. One group said, keep doing what you're doing. The other group said, hey, stop using Facebook. And the group that stopped using Facebook, obviously they saved 14 hours a week, and spontaneously, without the researchers telling them to do anything. They started exercising more, cooking more, doing all these health behaviors because they magically found the time that obviously that they never thought they had. And the rates of depression went down 16%. So they felt better as well. So there's some at least suggestive evidence that this practice not only helps people feel better, but literally it saves your life in terms of all this time that you didn't know that you had is now freed up to do things that are better, healthier, and quite frankly, more aligned with your values.
Yeah, I was going to touch on this topic because you've mentioned the article that you've written, which we will link in the show notes. And I pretty much see you as, you could say, the pioneer on the topic of dopamine fasting, because you published this. Right. And then there was an influx of Gen Zs on YouTube making videos on this topic with catchy clickbait titles. And there's some of them are selling courses on the topic of dopamine fasting. So you should be getting some of that in forms of royalty. But anyway, before we go on to sort of a couple of other topics, just to wrap up this topic, I do agree with all of this. And I think especially in the sort of VC Twitter and tech bro Twitter space, where there is an endless amount of signaling and people seeking self-validation and just non-stop. Some of these people I genuinely question on Twitter when they get any work done. They're just burning VC money and just scrolling. And so what advice, other than sort of, let's say, blocking 1 hour a day, if there was just, apart from blocking, let's say, an hour a day, if you were to give just one tip to people they can action today to sort of help, because most people are locked inside right now and they're just addicted to their phones and devices. They have no choice. What is one thing you could give?
Justify your ROI. I have a whole Twitter thread about this too, which is like, what are you using it for? Be really honest with yourself. Most people are like, oh, I catch up with news. I'm understanding what's going on in the tech world. Quite honestly, most people are doing it because it's bored and it's addictive, right? It's not actually producing any personal or professional ROI. The difference is, like with my Twitter, I can literally point out to the monetization. I make 6 figures a year from Twitter. And I say that publicly. I get clients from it. I get VC deals from it, etc. And even then, I hate Twitter, by the way. Like, honestly, if I did not monetize it, wasn't so good professionally, I wouldn't use it at all. The problem with Twitter is there's a power loud dynamic with it, in that 95% of people probably don't derive any ROI from it. So there's some people who, whether they're explicitly selling stuff, obviously they're making money. I'm explicitly not. I'm like, look, I basically give away free content. All my knowledge and wisdom is free. You don't pay for anything. I don't sell any courses, none of that stuff. But people like what I have to share, and they know me, right? And they're like, oh, if I am looking for a psychologist or whatever, they naturally hit me up. I never even intended it for it to be that way. I just I'm an opinionated person who thinks about things. And so I enjoyed sharing it on Twitter. And plus I'm like, I want to bring ACT to the world. It's kind of a niche psychotherapy that no one kind of outside of psychology knows, but I think it's a very useful philosophy for living life. So I started sharing a lot about ACT because it's like almost an operating system to live better. And people resonated with that. And then they're like, oh, okay, I'll do that. So I guess that's my advice to people is like, look, I don't think most founders, quite frankly, should be on Twitter at all. It doesn't provide any ROI to your business. This whole building in public thing is a bunch of hokey nonsense for most people. Unless you can monetize and quantify, like this is when I tweet, it's resulting in X conversions, just like a good digital marketing person can, then fine, absolutely use it. There are some founders who do it really well, obviously. But I think there's a different model. I think you should basically acknowledge whether you're a founder influencer, is what I call it. There's a founder influencer model. Dave Asprey is one of them. We're obviously kind of following in those footsteps too, where that's the business model, right, of the business. And you have to be publicly out there. For a lot of other people, you're running a SaaS company. Like, why do you need to be an influencer? To be honest with you, sell fucking good product. You don't you don't need to be a guru, for God's sake. I think honestly, a lot of people do it out of a narcissistic, purpose. Funnily, I talked to Dave before going down this path and business model, because I was like, I'm an introvert. I don't like being famous. I want to be anonymous and rich. Like, forget this stuff. But Dave was like, look, I was the same way. I was a cybersecurity professional. I would literally erase my name off of the entire internet. You couldn't find me on Google back in the day. But I realized in order to have a successful consumer company, I need to become Dave Asprey, the Bulletproof executive. And so he kind of reluctantly did it towards the purpose of his company, which I really like too, because that's a more mission-driven, values-driven approach to things. And it's the same thing with me. Like I always say, I'm a reluctant entrepreneur. I'm a reluctant, I don't even use the word God influencer, but whatever, thought leader, whatever it is, because it's good for the business. And I would never do it as a standalone. Like I don't want to be a Jordan Peterson selling books and giving tours, and no interest in that whatsoever. So I think people should be honest about what business purpose does it serve, and if they can quantify and justify it. Otherwise, don't use it so much, or if you are going to use it literally for shits and giggles, that's fine too, but limit it, because, probably using it for more than 30 minutes a day becomes a negative ROI.
I want to just test you on that influencer point a little bit more, because you I think on Jeffrey Woo's podcast, you talk about your psychological archetype theory of influencers. Yeah. And specific to that, in our space, there's a lot of people propping up that are setting up rolling funds, i.e. they're using their background, their influence, who they are as a person, to basically raise money off everyone, off accredited investors in the space. We've talked about it from a democratization perspective on other podcasts, like, it's great that people have access, but is there a downside or a dangerous element to it that builds on your archetype theory? And is there anything we can do to stop it happening or to be aware of it?
I don't think we should stop it happening. I like what AngelList and Naval are doing, quite frankly, for the democratization of investing. I had a syndicate for a while when I was working in VC to make angel investments. It makes a convenient platform because people don't want to deal with the back end and the paperwork. So I think it's a great thing. I think, though, this kind of goes back to individual choice as a founder. I think the danger is, like, look, if you do have a reputation as a brand as a founder, people assume that if you've made a lot of money in your business, that you're good with money, which is, by the way, a very false assumption. Being a good CEO does not make you a good investor. Being a good investor does not make you a good CEO. It's rare, actually, the people who are good at both. It's a poor heuristic. But I mean, there may be some elements of truth that you're a very famous founder, you may get better deal flow. And so obviously you may, as a random whatever tech employee, get better access to deals going through someone's syndicate or rolling fund than you would on your own. That's a fair proposition. But I would say for the investors, don't invest anything that you're not willing to lose. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of people who, because investing is so sexy, they're investing to say that they're an angel investor, and they can put it on their Twitter bio, whatever. I'm like, you can go put your 20 grand in a savings account and or buy some property. Like, nobody in the Bay Area owns anything. So it's way cooler to have a house than say you invested in some random company, in my opinion. Or maybe it's not cool, but it's the right thing to do. So that's my point of view. I actually am not a fan of these rolling funds for most founders. I'm like, you should be busy running your business. And I think it's a distraction. I don't think a lot of the great founders, quite frankly, are super active on Twitter, or should be running a bunch of enrolling funds. I'm like, you're not focusing on your business. It's a different story if you're like Stripe level, the company's killing it, you're basically going public, you have a huge army of people to run the things, and you have proprietary deal flow, and you're going to invest in a couple of deals a year. That's a different story. But if you haven't proven yourself and the business isn't big, I think it's a distraction. And I followed what I preach. I stopped investing essentially when I started this company. Because I'm like, look, there are some things that I do. I still teach an hour a week. It doesn't take a lot of time investment. So I'm going to keep that in order to keep my professorial gig. But it's too much time to be looking at a bunch of deals every week. And it's a distraction from the business. So I really do believe in Cal Newport's deep work, deep focus. Do one thing and do it well. And sure, you can do some things on the side, but they should not be distractions from your business. So maybe that's an unpopular opinion, but I'll say it anyway.
Yeah, I was going to say Frank Slootman is a great example of what you just outlined as a...
He's my CEO hero. So yeah, I think people should study a lot more of Frank Slootman and a lot less of these like public, CEOs. I don't think he's on Twitter. And he's probably the most massive value generating CEO of this generation, next to maybe Elon and Bezos.
Cool. And then before we go on to the final rounds, if you were to give some actionable advice on what we should look out for in assessing people in there's A and B. A being founders who are hiring, and B investors who are actually investing in the pre-seed and seed. Because at this stage, you're essentially betting on the individual and not the business. It's kind of similar to SPACs and rolling funds. It's a lot of how you assess human nature, basically. And I don't think there's a better person other than you to really give some advice on this. And I mean, things I look for: very high level tonality, body language, ton of other things, some of the vocab they use, but still it's extremely hard sometimes to tell if someone is full of BS, especially when some of these people are some of the best salespeople you've ever seen in the world. So how do you cut through the BS, and what should people really look for when assessing people?
Well, the challenge is there's two different things at play. One is, what are the traits that you are looking for in assessing people? And the second is, how accurately can you assess them? That's the latter is actually the harder challenge. It's easy to say the right things that you're looking for. It's hard to do it well. It's hard to do it accurately. So I'll answer this question in two parts. One is for hiring employees, and then there's a different criteria for hiring founders. I like to use the Big Five personality inventory. It's the most evidence-based personality assessment. People should stop using the MBTI. I'll say it now. If you're using the MBTI or the Enneagram, you're basically using astrology. And we live in 2021, so stop it. The Big Five is very well validated. It's reliable. It's valid. It's been used in many, many different countries. It's free. It's open source. There's a version called the Neo, IPIP Neo, I believe it's called. You can find it. You can take your personality test online. We actually use it in our hiring process. The things that we're basically looking for is high conscientiousness is the best predictor of professional success. You're looking for someone who's diligent, ambitious, organized, follows through. If you don't have those skills, it's just hard to be good at any particular task that you do. There may be certain roles that are a little bit less important, maybe like the really creative designer-ish roles, that may be more important to have a little bit more openness to experience, imaginativeness, artistic interest. But those are almost like barely tech roles, to be honest with you, right? But yeah, most other roles need a high degree of conscientiousness. So you want high conscientiousness. You want low to moderate neuroticism. Neuroticism is basically emotional stability. It's fine. Like I said, a lot of people are quirky and have some pathology, but it can't be so high, because if they're high in vulnerability or low in resilience, they're going to fall apart under stress. And startups are stressful, and they can be awesome, but they're just going to wither away. So you don't want someone who's too neurotic, because it's hard to deal with, quite honestly. And then let's see what else. You want someone who's moderate to high in agreeableness. You don't want someone who's really disagreeable, like below 20th percentile in agreeableness. It's basically a proxy for the dark triad that I mentioned, the narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy. If you're not assessing that directly, highly disagreeable people are a pain in the ass to deal with, and they're basically assholes. So we screen those people out. There is a converse issue of like people being too agreeable as well. But it's easier for me to deal with that. I can teach people to push back and be a little bit more forthcoming. You can't teach an asshole not to be an asshole. So those are the three things. Those are the three personality traits that I generally look for. Introversion, extroversion doesn't matter that much, actually. Even for sales, Adam Grant, a colleague of mine who I went to school with actually at Harvard, showed that ambiverts actually are the best salespeople, contrary to the whole extroversion thing. So I don't think it matters that much. If they're really extreme on either end, you may want to just be a little bit aware that they might need certain contexts. Extroverts are not doing well in a remote work from home environment, and super introverted people do not like busy offices. So just make sure the environment is conducive to them, but they can both be really great. And openness to experience, like I said, outside of artistic interests doesn't really predict that much in terms of performance. That's what I look for in employees. That's my model. You should figure out what it is that you look for. But I think the more important message is whatever framework that you choose, you should use it in your hiring process, because otherwise you say it's important, but how are you actually using it? So I have a whole article on this that I recommend. It's called Your Company Cultures Who You Hire, Fire, and Promote. It's my whole framework for doing performance evaluations and hiring that incorporates values. So if you have I talked about personality traits, but if there's values that you have, like it's really important to be high integrity or honorable at your company, you should be evaluating that in their performance reviews. Because if they're killing it technically, but they're doing shady shit and they're getting away with it because it's not part of your performance evaluation, then you're reinforcing bad behavior. Basically saying, we say it's important, but we don't really actually care, which is basically what 80% of companies do. So if you're not reinforcing it and you're not promoting people or firing people based on your values, then your values are not your values. They're just BS that looks good on the wall. So that's my cynical behavioral point of view. I can talk about it for founders as well. I have a bunch of criteria that I look at when I'm an investor. I like people who are execution driven. They're very like the charismatic recruiter type who can, quite frankly, convince people. They can sell, ice to an Eskimo kind of types of people. I think people who have really deep insights into the market and customers and have a unique vantage point about why their company is different or set up to succeed. And finally, someone who's emotionally intelligent and coachable. They need to be able to get feedback, right? If they're too ego-driven, narcissistic, they can't be proven wrong. And when the market slaps them upside the head and tells them they need to pivot, they don't listen. So those are the 4 things that I look for. I actually did a whole data science project to validate these things. It's actually predictive of ROI using a data set, but assessing them is another story, and we can leave that for another time.
We'd like to see that, but that is very, very interesting. The way we end our shows, because we're coming up towards the end of this, is we like to do a long or short round. So we like to ask you something, and we want a 1-word answer. And you see it, and you're a nuanced individual. So I want you to hold back on giving any reason.
One word it is.
So first one, social media apps. Are you long or short?
Short.
Okay. Meditation.
Long.
Psychedelics.
Long.
Miami.
Also long.
Finally, masculinity.
Super long.
Good.
Awesome. And then finally, before we really do wrap up, is really just to ask, what are the top 3 books in no particular order that have sort of helped shape you in any way, whether it's personal life, business, and that has just really helped shape your worldview in your whole life up until today, really?
Oh man, it's a great question. It's super hard to pick 3, but I'll just tell you the 3 that randomly come to the top of my mind, no particular order. I actually really like this book called The Power of Full Engagement by, I believe it's Jim Lohr and Tony Schwartz. I heard them talk actually when I was a senior at Harvard. And it was honestly like the best lecture I ever got in college. And the thought crossed through my mind is I wish they taught this to me as a freshman, because I didn't know how to study. And I would have studied very differently. Their whole thesis is the secret to productivity is not time management, but energy management. And it comes from their practice of coaching professional tennis athletes. And they apply it in a lot of ways, like my private practice, to corporate executives. And so it uses a lot of basically methods similar to Pomodoro or interval training to set people up to do sort of deep, intense work and use a lot of breaks and recovery. It informs how I do my practice. I'll give you a concrete example. I see sometimes clients, if it's a really busy day, from 10 to 6, but I don't schedule more than 2 in a row. And then I take an hour break after every 2 hours. And so by the time I get to the end of the day, which is like 8 hours of total work, 6 hours of client work with 2 hours of breaks in between, I am not exhausted because I use a lot of recovery within the day and in between meetings. I also try to schedule them to be 50 minutes. I take a 10-minute walk in between every meeting. I try to be really fastidious about it. And it really, really helps, especially in the Zoom era where everyone's sitting at home, their physical activity count is down. We're all fatigued from, staring into too much lights in our eyes. It makes a huge difference. So I think it's actually a very practical book for productivity, especially in the quarantine world that we're in. So highly recommend that book. Let's see what else. 2 other books. I actually like Way of the Peaceful Warrior. It's kind of an unconventional pick. It's by Dan Millman. It's kind of a new agey spiritual book, which is funny because I'm really not into that stuff, but it's kind of an amalgamation of a lot of wisdom that comes from various teachers that he's studied, that he's kind of put into this figure Socrates, and it's about a Berkeley college student who wants to be a world champion gymnast. He gets into a tragic accident. It's kind of semi-autobiographical, and has to start his life over and kind of find a different purpose for his life. And I think what I like about it is, introduces people to, a different framework for sort of evaluating the bigger picture of life, which is more values oriented. So I really like that book. And then I'll pick a fiction book because I think people actually should read more fiction, which is Shantaram by Gregory David Roberts. It's a behemoth 900-page book, but it's a beautiful book about an Australian bank robber who was a drug addict who escapes as a refugee to India, starts his life over, and works as a medical assistant in the slums of India in order to redeem himself as a man and lead a better life. And it's a very beautiful and poetic love story about his love of a woman that he falls in love with, his love of India, the love of the relationships and brotherhoods that he makes. And I think it helps people to get in touch with, a more sort of emotional side of themselves, which I think is really important as well.
You're the first guest we've had that has given an answer as a fictional book as part of their answer. So kudos. Finally, where can people find you, Dr. Cam and Maximus? How do people join up to Maximus if they want to?
Yeah, go to bemaximus.com, bemaximus.com. Right now, as I mentioned, the site is not fully up yet, but there's a link to our community. So you can absolutely join those. We have a Discord, Facebook, and Reddit community. Discord's the most active. That's where I would start. So join our communities. And then as we obviously launch our product in the next quarter, they can avail themselves of those. So go there. I'm unfortunately semi-active on social media, despite what I said. So you can find me on Twitter at Dr. Sepah, DrSepah. I would say the best way though is as part of our communities, I have a podcast and weekly call-in radio show. It's actually Thursdays at 6:00 Pacific time. You can literally call in and get advice from me. So I'm a very expensive and busy coach, and I generally take on new clients, but you can call and ask free questions. So it's actually a really great perk for people, for them to do. And you can catch previous episodes on Apple and Spotify as well.
Awesome. I'll put everything in the show notes. And really enjoyed this conversation, Dr. Cam. Probably one of my favorite episodes so far because a lot of topics that I'm super interested in. Any final thoughts before we say goodbye?
No, I just really appreciate your guys' time and vision for what you're doing. And I hope it benefits, people out there who are trying to do good things and start new companies and invest in good places. So I think that the final message I would just say is, my main thesis and message and to take home is, invest in yourself. There's so much, I think, social pressure to do the cool thing or the popular thing, or you feel FOMO. When, in reality, if you step out of the Silicon Valley bubble, making sure that you're taking care of your health, that you can never, ever go wrong. So I'll always do that. And it's not to take away from your success, but my thesis is that it enables it.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, ladies and gents. Dr. Cam.